Hi everyone. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed my lecture yesterday and didn't have any problems in submitting the quiz and daily writing assignment yesterday. So every daily assignment, I mean quiz and writing assignment, take on 5% of the whole year grade. So please take it seriously and make sure to submit it on time. Alright, so today I want to talk about the poverty, which is some kind of fundamental ground of the social problems in the US or other countries, but this class I want to concentrate on the US issues. So in the textbook, there are some contents about the global poverty and the activities to improve the anti-poverty activities in the world, but I just concentrated on the US context today. So make sure to see and to gather the concepts to answer your questions in the quiz and the writing assignment. So the poverty, which is the social problem. So yesterday we covered that the poverty or the social problem should be affecting the large amount of people and also should be perceived as the social problem by the society of the US. So you can see the statistics, which is the empirical part of the poverty here in the 2016. So about some 16% or 13% of the people are below the poverty level, which is the income has $24,000 per year for the family with the 4 members. So it's quite very small amount of money to support their life. So it's very serious to be in below that line. So you can see that the children, seniors, and by the ethnic groups, you can see the amount of people who are in the poor or poor level of the life. So you can see large amount of people are under the poverty line, and this is measured by the census or many government agencies and academia. So we can see poverty is a social problem in the US. So why poverty matters? So does poverty makes our life bad, or is the poverty issue related with us? Possibly or not. So USA will need to spend much money. So poverty issues include the crime and health or family problems such as divorce, domestic violence, and any other victimizations of those problems. So USA will need to spend much more money to spend or to support their life. And about 75% of the Americans live around or in poverty at least 1 year in their life. So we cannot say that poverty is out of our life and poverty is not related with life, because there is very high chance of the Americans who should be around the poverty line and who should have some government aid or social support because of the poverty problems or poverty issues. And higher rate of poverty prevent the economic progress, because the poor people under the $20,000 income cannot purchase the goods and cannot purchase services. So for the jobs or corporations, they need to have some services and the money to get some purchases. So having the higher rate of the poverty will prevent some good consumptions to boost up the economy of the US. And poverty increases chance of crime and social problems, because being in poor status is very stressful issue, because they cannot spend money and they cannot support their family and they cannot buy some food or they cannot afford a rent. So it's very stressful to be in the poverty. So the poverty should be considered as the serious problem in the US. So measurement of the poverty. So what is the poverty? Being a poor and having the low money. So there are many definitions by the individuals like us. So the official poverty measurement is the poverty line. So in 1963, US government decided to have the official line to preserve or some define the poverty issues. So poverty line was defined as the estimated cost for the minimal diet. So after multiplying the 3 times for the cost of the minimal diet, that would be some poverty line. So below that line, people would be considered as the poor people. However, many other expenses for their life were ignored in the poverty line. So essential costs such as rent or some instead of except the food, there are rent or electricity or medical bills essential for the life. However, those costs were not included in the poverty line. So it's very suspicious to perceive it as the very good measure. However, so because of a lack of consideration of the difference of the cost by the region, and it's also problematic because living in the metropolitan area like Manhattan or New York, or living in very outer land of the Middle East or outer land of the middle of the US would be very different. But they unitely or they use the same measure for the poverty in everywhere in the US. So it was very hard to define the poor, and it was very hard to make a good measurement for the poor by using the poverty line to see who are really poor and who are really in needs. So the measurement of the poverty was adjusted. So in every year, because of the costs or consumptions, the poverty line was renewed in every year. So in 2016, the poverty line was $24,000. However, how about the people who earn $20,001? Will they be not poor people? So is it possible to give some money to the poor people and don't give some financial support for the people who have $24,001 as their income? So it was very hard to find the good threshold to support the poor. So poverty experts suggested that twice the poverty line is needed because they should account for food or money for the clothing, shelter, rent for the housing or medical bills. So using twice poverty data would be more appropriate than just using the simple poverty line as the official poverty measure. So I want to show the trend of the poverty in the US. So by using the poverty line, even though it was not very especially good, so it was good measure to estimate the number of the people or the rate of the people under the poor condition. So you can see there are some like a big fluctuations of the poverty people or in the poor people. So more number in poverty is increased a lot in these days because of the recession, the global recession around the 2009. But still, we have 40.6 million people under the poverty line. And the rate is also very interesting because even though there are some fluctuations of the poverty rate, we keep the 12.7% of the poverty people in the US. So it was very high in around the 1960s, but the US, their government declared the war on poverty around the 1960s by increasing the government fund for the education and financial aid and food. So it decreased the poverty rate very dramatically. However, there is a constant poverty rate during the 1959 through 2016 period. So there are other measures of the poverty, such as episodic poverty, measuring or counting people who are under the poor condition at least 2 months in some period of time. So during 2004 and 2007, about 95 million, which is about 30% of the whole population in the US, experienced episodic poverty. So this is a measure to see when the people have some like experience of temporary poverty. So it's also a good measure to see if they experience some poverty in their life. And supplemental poverty measure takes account the family expenses, differential of the cost of living by the region, and government aid. So by this measure, about 46.2 million people were poor in 2010. So we mentioned that the previous one, the poverty line, simply and originally was not a good measure to see the number of the poor people in the U.S. because it does not account for the other living expenses. So using the twice poverty line or using the supplemental poverty measure would be appropriate to see the reality of the U.S. population who are in the poverty or around the poverty level. So official poverty rate is based on the size of the family and the minimum food budget of the diet level. But it underestimates the true extent of the poverty because about twice of the poverty line is used for measure to estimate the number of the people who are under poverty level or who are in the poor status. So social pattern of the poverty. So as we saw in the trend of the poverty, we saw there are many people by the race and by the gender. We could see the different pattern of the poverty. So the most typical poor person in the U.S. is non-Latino white. 42% of the whole poor people is the white. So it's kind of the statistical meaning or statistical result because whites are about 60 or 65% of the whole U.S. population. So they may have some larger portion of the poor people under the poverty level. However, if we see the rate of the poverty by the race, so within race, 27%. About 28% of the Native Americans are under the poverty level. Around 26% of the blacks and 23% are under the poverty level. So compared with the 20 or 12% of the white and Asian people. So we can see there are very drastic difference between the minority members. I mean, Asians are also minority members, but they are richer, relatively richer than other minority races. So Native Americans and blacks and Hispanics have higher poverty rate than whites and Asian. So we can see this is the issue of the colors of poverty that the people of color may have higher poverty level compared with the white. So poverty by the gender. So this is a gender issue I will cover in the later chapters. But gender gap is the exists in the U.S. So about 3% of the gap exists in the gender in the rate of the poverty. So we call it as a feminization of the poverty. So we can see the women are more likely to be poor than men in the whole age groups, in the whole race groups. So poverty by age. So we can see 21% and 9% of the children and seniors are in the poor condition. So we can count that about 30% of the people are in the poor condition in the U.S. population. So under 18 years old, we call that they are children. So 21% for the whole population. However, about 39% for the blacks and 35% for the Hispanic children are under the poor condition, which is very high. So this is very problematic condition. If they are in the poor condition in the young age period, it means that they cannot have good education and good nutrition, and they have some chances to have an extended period of the poverty because of the poor condition of the education and nutrition. So it's very hard to get a good job without good education and without good health. So the earlier stages of the inequalities in their life will result in the permanent poor condition in their life. And also about 9% of senior citizens are poor, which means their later life will not be very good. So poverty by the region and the family structure. So south area of the U.S. is the has the highest rate of the poverty, and the west and midwest and northeast follows either. And female-headed families have the highest poverty rate compared with the male-headed family and a couple-headed by headed family. So a woman has some discrimination, and even though they have the higher level of education compared with the men, they have some discrimination and the gender wage gap and other problems such as child care costs or care work costs like that. So women are more likely to be poor if they had or if they are the house head or household member. So they have the highest poverty rate at 31%, which is very high. So poverty by the labor force status. I want to show it because there is like a very massive belief that the poor people are very poor because of their failure and because they are not working well and they have no motivations to work. However, according to the status or statistics in 2010, about 80% of poor people were either working or looking for a job, and they were too young or too old to work. So they were working or finding working or not in good condition to work. So unless 20 people of the poor may have some care work loss or have some health problems. Surely they may not want to work, but less than 20%. I mean, less about we don't know the exact number of the people who don't work, and because of the because they are poor and they are poor because they don't work. But we can see about 80% of people, which is the majority of the people, are working or looking for a job, or they are not in the condition of work. So it's kind of myth that poor people are too lazy or lack of motivation to work, and that's why they are poor. So we can debunk some problems of this myth, because this kind of belief lead the people have some prejudice to the poor people and don't want to care about the poverty level in the US. So we may need to look through the poverty issue, which is some structural problems, not just merely the individual problem. So people of color have higher poverty rate, even though the most typical poor person in the US is non-Latino white. So US poverty rate for the children is very high compared with other developed countries, which may some many problems in the later. And labor force participation indicate that it's a myth that the poor people are poor because they lack of motivation to work. So I want to suggest the theory and the result of the poverty. So we covered the three major theory perspectives in the social problem, such as functionalism and conflict theory and interaction theory. So functionalism says that stratification, I mean inequality, is necessary to induce the people with the special intelligence, knowledge, and skills to enter the most important jobs. So inequality and stratification is necessary to the and inevitable. So functionalists don't want to make some social changes, and they weigh more on the smart people. So for example, they think the knowledge of the medical assistants, I mean medical school, is more important than others, because helping people to have some health or healthier condition is more important than the dishing jobs or cashier jobs and other poor jobs. So the skills and knowledge should be benefited by the society, because they need to pay for education, because the medical school or the law school pay more than other schools. So if the society want to have more doctors and lawyers, they need to benefit the lawyers and medical doctors, because they should be willing to enter the school to get a jobs. So the functionalism says that the inequality or the poverty is necessary and inevitable because there are innate the hierarchy of the jobs and occupations. However, complete theory says that inequality and the stratification result from the lack of chances and the discriminations and prejudice against the minorities. So poor are poor because they lack of chances and educations and didn't have the good chances of the find a good job. So it's neither necessary or nor inevitable. So I'm sorry for using the interaction theory in here. So interaction is simple interaction is to find that inequality and stratification affect people's belief and perspectives and life of themselves. So explanation of the poverty. So there are two major assumptions for the explanations about the poverty. So in the micro level, in the individualistic view, result in the poverty. So poverty results from the fact that for people lack of motivation and work not hard, doesn't work hard. So thus this kind of the beliefs and values contribute to poverty. So sometimes it's very problematic because individualistic view blames the people who are poor and because they think the poor are poor because of their failures. But the structural view says that poverty results from the problems in the society that lead to lack of opportunities and jobs. So, for example, the minorities cannot have a good job because they live in the poor area with the low quality of the education. So the poor children cannot have some good education and good health, and they result in less competency of the in their job market, and they cannot earn good money, and they cannot have some good education later. So they earn small amount of money compared with other rich people, and they cannot support their children, and their children will be poor as well, and so accumulated inequality will persist in their life and in the generations. So this is a structural view that poverty results in the structural problems in the U.S. So the poor personal problems and deficiencies, so they are responsible for the poverty in the individualistic view. So this view represents the cultural poverty theory, argues that poor are poor because of them. So critics say that this view ignores discriminations and structural inequalities, as I mentioned before. So structural explanations is that U.S. poverty stems from the structural problems of the U.S. So because of the lack of jobs and discriminations and education system and changes of the economic system result in the poverty in the U.S. So sociology usually prefer the structural explanations because in the macro theory and in the other micro theory, sociologists view the outer effects. I mean, the contextual problems are increasing the chance of the poverty for the poor people. But in the integrated perspective between the structural explanations and individual explanations says that cultural poverty may exist. So maybe the poverty result from the failure of the individuals. However, the cultural poverty can be affected by the structural effect of the society. That low level of education by the poor people may affect their poverty, but they didn't have some good chance to get the education even though they were smart or something. So structural effects are not ignorable compared with the individualistic problems. So there are many problems generated by the poverty. So there are many problems in the family. So families are poor have more stress or has problems than richer family, resulting in many family problems such as divorce, domestic violence, or family breakup also. Poor families have fewer resources than wealthier families to deal with those problems. So if they are rich, they can buy some goods or they can have some better life conditions to lower down the stresses. But if they are poor, they cannot deal with those personal problems. And also the health and illness and medical care problems are deeply related with the poor people, because the poor have higher chance of the health problems, like infant mortality or the other mortality problems and mental illness and other related health problems. However, the poor are uninsured or underinsured, and they may have the low income to pay for medical assistance. So if they don't have some good medical assistance programs such as Medicaid or other insurances for the poor people, they cannot go to the hospital to get some medical services. So if they don't go to the medical service centers in the early stage of the illness, they have higher chance of the serious illness and result in the higher mortality. So this is like a vicious chain of the problems of poverty affecting the health problems. Also, there's the education problem for the poor people. So poor children cannot go to good school like a boarding school or even just good schools. So they go very poor area and they live in the poor area. They go to poor schools with lack of the educational goods, educational tools. So they receive very bad or lack of the good quality schooling. And poor people performance and poor school performance may result in some penalties or disadvantages of the higher education, and they may result in some lack of the credentials to enter a good job. And also housing and homelessness is a very big issue, because they cannot afford for the paying for the or purchasing their own home, so they need to pay rent, especially in the metropolitan area or the suburb area or the big city area around this, like here. They may need to pay high rent because they don't own their home. So their rent may consist of the very high portion of their income. So they may lack of the other spendings. So living in the poor area results in lack of enough resources such as good education or care system like that. And also the crime and victimization is a big issue of the poverty. So the poor and near poor people have a higher chance of being accounted for the street crime and victims of the crimes. So if they live in the poor neighborhood area, they may be having some high chance of the being a victim of the this crime. And also they have some higher chance of meeting people in the gang or who are in the crime like that. So because of the different association and the neighborhood condition of the poor, they have higher chance of the crime and victimization. So theories explain why inequality and stratification exists and poor people exist. So poor people are more likely to have several kinds of problems affecting their life. And children growing up in the poverty area or poverty condition are less likely to have a good education and good health, and more likely to commit crime and to be a crime victim. So the reasons in poverty. So we covered that we have the very high poverty rate, and poverty has very serious consequences. So how could we deal with those poverty problems? So poverty rate declined from 1960s from 22% to 11% in the 1973, which was very dramatic changes. So now it's about 12.7% in the 2016, which is relatively higher than 1973, but after the global recession after 2009, yeah, it takes effect still. So belief toward poor, cultural poverty lead U.S. neglect poverty issues that lead people think poor, and poor are due to poor are very lazy and they lack of the credentials. So those problems are their own problems. So however, poverty affects us all, because as I mentioned in the earlier part of the lecture, if the poverty rate goes up, the economic condition or economic system cannot develop because on the market, because of the market problem. So if we have the big market or with the good purchasing power, corporations can be developed in many areas. But if there are some less number of people who can purchase their goods, it's very hard to develop the economy of the U.S. So anti-poverty agendas or policies are needed in the political areas as well. So anti-poverty programs are designed to help the poor to get out of their status of the poor. So employment policies can help them provide more number and qualified jobs for the poor, increasing the minimum wage so that they can afford their families in the better condition. So increasing federal aid for the working poor. So even though they are working, if they work in the third sector, such as low income jobs, and they may have some poor condition, but increasing aid for the working poor and the childhood intervention program and schooling programs, they may have some better chances to get the higher education and to get a higher income. And also providing the aid for the housing and better nutrition and health services will help them. And also increasing grants and other financial aid for the higher education will help them. So especially the education effect are very important to upgrade their credentials. So going to the graduate school in the professional degrees or special educations or better education such as medical schools or law schools will increase their expected income. So those aids will be very helpful to help the poor people to improve their status or enter in the rich people or rich area or rich class of the people. So a change in the view toward the poverty and the poor political actions will be necessary for the renewed support for the poor Americans. And successful anti-poverty program and the policies should be maintained to support the poor people, like expanding employment and greater financial and education support. So we just covered the poverty issue in the U.S. So we also have the daily quiz and daily writings. So the due is before 11 and 9:59 p.m. and July 31st. And feel free to let me know if you have any problems or questions regarding the course and the assignments. Okay, so good luck in your quiz and daily writings. See you tomorrow. Thank you.